intimately involved in the complicated diplomacy of the war years.
I would argue that the greatest accomplishment of Roosevelt during World War II were the commanding officers he picked, people like George Marshall, Nimitz. You know, these are the great names of World War II, yet Roosevelt was their boss.
Succumbing to anti-Japanese hysteria, FDR ordered the internment of more than 100,000 Japanese Americans on February 19, 1942.
Their feeling was that the Western United States in particular was filled with Japanese Americans and that they couldn't fully be trusted. It's probably a low moment of the Roosevelt administration, and most historians have been quite critical of it.
Roosevelt has also been criticized for his failure to respond to the plight of European Jews, who were facing extermination under Hitler's final solution. The White House knew about the Nazi concentration camps as early as November 1942. Yet Roosevelt made no extraordinary effort to help Jewish refugees.
It sounds callous, but he probably considered what was happening to European Jews not of the first importance in his agenda.
Roosevelt was always very clear on this. He felt that the most important thing he could do was to win the war, and that was going to help those who were in Hitler's concentration camps the most.
For Roosevelt, winning the war meant launching a massive assault on mainland Europe, D-Day.
Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity.
It was the greatest logistic effort ever conceived, and Franklin Roosevelt deserves credit for it almost in its entirety.
5 months after D-Day, Roosevelt was re-elected to a fourth term, but he was 62 years old and his health was failing.
It's humanly understandable, I suppose, why anybody who had served 3 terms as president, presided over this war effort to this point in late 1944, wanted to stay on board long enough to see the thing through to conclusion. But in some ways, I think it was an irresponsible act. I think he would have been better advised to step aside at that point and let a more capable leader play the end game.
The end game of the war took place at Yalta in February 1945 with a meeting of the Allies to discuss the shape of the new world order. Here, FDR fulfilled the vision of Woodrow Wilson when he and Churchill convinced Stalin to sign off on the plan for an international peacekeeping organization, the United Nations. On April 12, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage, bringing an end to the longest and one of the greatest presidencies in American history.
To be ranked as a great president, you almost surely need some kind of crisis that you have to deal with. Roosevelt got handed not one but 2 crises of enormous proportions.
He had the Depression in the 1930s, and he had a global war in the 1940s. And what is so unique about him is that he had the personal and political tools to excel in both of those crisis situations.
I think the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt changed the presidency more than any other single presidency did in terms of the kinds of policies and actions that the government would now be willing to undertake, and it also changed it in the way in which it made the president himself a titanic figure in the mind of the nation, the way that it had never been before.
With his unusual alchemy of charm and arrogance, improvisation and political cunning, FDR changed the very idea of what it meant to be President of the United States. All future presidents would have to reckon with his legacy.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the 32nd President of the United States. He was born in Hyde Park, New York on January 30th, 1882. Coming from a wealthy family, he received special tutoring and yearly trips to Europe. He attended Groton School in Groton, Massachusetts, and went on to Harvard University. He was on the rowing and football teams, and after graduation, enrolled at Columbia Law School. He passed the exam, but left school early, for he had no desire to become a lawyer. Against his mother's wishes, he married his distant cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, the president, gave his niece, Eleanor, away. FDR became senator in 1910 and 1912. President Wilson appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was nominated for vice president on the Democratic ticket with James Cox in 1920, but they were defeated by Harding Coolidge. In 1921, he fell into icy waters in Canada and developed polio. He lost the use of his legs and was partially paralyzed in the arms and hands. He eventually regained the use of his arms and hands, but had to learn to walk with braces. Everyone thought that his political career was over, but FDR never gave up, and he didn't let his handicap bother him. In 1928, he became governor of New York. He got tax relief for farmers in 1930 and relief for the unemployed. He was so popular that he was re-elected in 1930. In 1932, he persuaded James Farley, the Democratic Party chairman, to direct his campaign. He won the nomination in Chicago, and he promised the country an end to the Depression with his New Deal. He also promised an end to Prohibition. He won in a landslide victory over Herbert Hoover. The 21st Amendment ended Prohibition in 1933, and the Social Security Act was passed in 1935. Also in 1935, the National Labor Relations Act gave labor the machinery for collective bargaining with industry. President Roosevelt greatly improved U.S. relations in South America with the Good Neighbor policy, and when he went to Colombia in 1934, he became the first president to visit South America. FDR was re-elected in 1936, and the Supreme Court ruled that a number of new acts were unconstitutional. He set out to reorganize the court. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and World War II began. Roosevelt told Britain and France that he would help them as best he could. In 1940, he was re-elected for a third term and promised America that he would not enter the war. But in 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and Roosevelt had to go back on his word and enter the war. FDR had already met with Winston Churchill on a cruiser off the coast of Newfoundland in 1940. They drafted the Atlantic Charter that promised that England and the United States did not seek any new territory. He also had several Big Three conferences with Churchill and Joseph Stalin, one in Tehran in 1943, one in Casablanca in 1943, and one in Yalta in 1945. Roosevelt was re-elected for an unprecedented fourth term in 1944, but he was not in good health. In March of 1945, he went to Warm Springs, Georgia, to try to regain his health. He was posing for a portrait on April 12, 1945, and complained of a terrible headache. He collapsed, and a few hours later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was dead. He never witnessed the victory over Japan and Germany and the end of the war. He is probably best known for his speech in 1941 when he said that we should fight for four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear.
(1933). Millions had reached rock bottom. Some felt the American system, capitalism, was tottering. Democracy itself was threatened. On March 4th, 1933, a frightened nation turned to Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
Franklin Roosevelt had a privileged upbringing. But at age 39, in the prime of his life, he was stricken with polio. Never again would Roosevelt walk unaided. Political scientist Barbara Kellerman.
What Franklin Roosevelt offered in the most remarkable fashion was a buoyant, optimistic, can-do attitude which gave the American people the confidence that they, together with his help, would be able to pull themselves out of the mire.
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
We were a nation crippled, paralyzed economically, and here we get a man who is himself paralyzed. And there's